Welcome back. U.S. President Donald Trump has announced a complete and total ceasefire between Israel and Iran after 12 days of intense fighting involving missiles and drone strikes. Israel has officially backed the deal, claiming it successfully neutralized Iran's nuclear and missile threats. Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, also thanked the U.S. for its support. However, Iran's foreign minister says that Tehran has not formally signed the agreement, but will hold fire as long as Israel does. Let's now bring in DIRCO's Director-General Zane Dangor into this conversation on more on the diplomatic implications of this unfolding situation. DG, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us this morning. What's Pretoria's take on the deal that has been negotiated by Donald Trump, and also the response to that deal from Iran as well as Israel?
Look, I think any ceasefire is a good one. And in this case, it's particularly important that we had a ceasefire given the sensitivity of the targets. Even though there was no nuclear weapons, the fact that you could have uranium being damaged and irradiation taking place, it's a danger to the entire region. And I think a ceasefire is important. The fact that both Iran and Israel have accepted the ceasefire, even though Iran may not have signed on it, they've accepted the terms of it, is important for all of us.
Yeah. And does it then lay the ground for a formal negotiations to be taking place, to start the negotiations and at least lay the table for a ceasefire that will actually hold, especially considering the volatility of the situation?
Well, I think the negotiations isn't really between Israel and Iran as much as it's the negotiations that impacts on the entire region. Remember, Iran was in negotiations with the U.S. around, restarting the nuclear deal. Also, there were a few days before the unlawful attack by Israel, in fact, in negotiations with Europe. So it's about essentially getting the negotiations around Iran's ability to use nuclear energy for peaceful means back on track, which is important for all of us who are members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. Iran is also a member of this. And for those of us who want to use nuclear weapons peacefully, this is very important negotiations because it deals with, what are the levels of enrichment that countries like Iran, South Africa, and others could be allowed. And also to ensure that you don't have a proliferation of nuclear weapons. No, our position is that no country should have nuclear weapons. But for those who do have it, we want to have the guardrails in place to ensure that, we don't have proliferation and that we only have nuclear energy used for civilian use.
Yeah. And with regards to that, especially with the NPT, just quickly explain to us, DG, ordinarily when it comes to the inspections that are being conducted by the IAEA, ordinarily what should be taking place? And I'm also basing this question on the chief director stating that Iran hasn't been forthcoming with information. As South Africa being a signatory to this treaty as well, ordinarily what happens?
So we're signatory to it, and we sit on the board of the NPT, or the IAEA. For us, any member state of the NPT must be fully accountable. And what we found in the last resolution that we abstained on, but others, overwhelmingly voted for, was to call for Iran to be more accountable and more accessible. But we must also bear in mind that nowhere in that resolution or in the findings was there any indication of weaponization taking place. So for us, the NPT is important to hold all countries that have nuclear capabilities accountable. The important issue to note here is that Iran has been doing this for a while. They've been, making themselves accessible to inspectors. The inspectors would have had access to the plants, the installations, and all to ensure that you don't enrich your uranium to weapons grade. And that has been happening, and there's been, the debates and discussions about in the last few years about whether there's been enough accountability. And ironically, the accountability has become an issue since the nuclear deal, which was a very important one that was negotiated between President Obama and Iran. And that was then also, verified through the processes of the NPT. So we want to get back to that space. And there was indications there were negotiations towards that before Israel launched its attack on Iran.
Yeah. What then should we, considering what you've just said now, DG, read into the decision that was taken by the Pentagon to attack those 3 nuclear sites in Iran? Because as the Pentagon had said, that this was actually something that they had planned long before the attack by Israel.
Well, there's many issues emerging from Washington, D.C. So on the one hand, you do have the intelligence community from the U.S. saying that, the intel they had was there was no weaponization in place, that Iran was in no way a few weeks or a few months away from having a nuclear weapon, which corresponds to the IAEA's own assessments. So 2 things should be considered here. The UN Charter states very clearly that only the Security Council can give the go-ahead for the use of force. So both Israel and the US breached the UN Charter. And in particular, there's also guardrails against attacking nuclear installations because of the safety issues, associated with nuclear fallout. Even uranium that's not weapons grade can still be a danger to all of us. And so you have serious breaches of international law from both Israel and the US in terms of the attacks that took place. So, the intel from both Washington, D.C., from the IAEA, indicates that there was no weaponization on the horizon. So the reasons given for the attacks doesn't appear to hold water.
Should there then be consequences that flow from this violation?
There should always be consequences for breaches of international law. Without the kind of guardrails and accountability that gives, real justifications for the use of force, and the Security Council to give the go-ahead under very strict circumstances, all of us become vulnerable. So both Israel and the US should be held accountable. And also Iran, I think, for its breaches of sovereignty with Qatar. For us, it's, the use of force should be used only when necessary. And it should always be legal. Civilians should never be victims of the use of force. And breaches of the Charter should be tackled by the international community for all our safety.
Yeah. And with regards to that, what is the stance then that Pretoria takes, also considering somewhat of a fraught relationship with the United States? You also have Israel in the ICJ case that South Africa has brought against Israel. I remember the time when there were talks about whether or not South Africa should be removed from AGOA. One of the points that were made bipartisan also by some of the lawmakers in the United States was South Africa's proximity to Iran. Are there any consequences, do you think, for South Africa with what is currently unfolding?
So proximity is a word that is used for very specific purposes. I mean, we've got diplomatic relations with most countries in the world, including Iran. We don't always agree on everything. For example, like I've said, we would be one of the countries that would hold them accountable within the NPT. When it comes to the Human Rights Council, we take very different position when it comes to certain human rights, the same as it is with the US and the EU and others. So our position is that we foreground international legality, that there should be no double standards, and we're going to express this in the manner that I'm doing now, in the manner that my colleagues have done, and we will also do this at the UN, and we will do this at the many multilateral fora that we have, because protecting the international legal space, as I said, it protects all of us, and we shouldn't shy away from that because we anticipate repercussions from the Hill or anywhere else. I think our position is clear that international law, human rights law, should pertain to all. There should be no double standards. There should be no exceptions to who is accountable. And we will engage with whoever feels differently politically, but for us, we need to ensure that we work with the international community to safeguard the international legal system that we have. As flawed as it is, it's the only one that is in place that can protect middle powers and small powers. Otherwise, big powers can actually do as they please.
Yeah, we had a conversation with Professor Oscar van Heerden about 2 days ago, and the point that he stresses is that, unfortunately, even with the multinational organizations, including the United Nations, they have seemingly lost their credibility and ability to hold the powerful accountable.
And I think the issue is not necessarily a credibility issue. It's a systems issue, right? So let's take the ICJ, for example. You have binding orders coming from the International Court of Justice. The only institution that can enforce that is the UN Security Council. And we can see what moribund the UN Security Council is. So what we need to do is ensure that we fix the system so that it works for us. The moment we abandon the multilateral system, the worse it becomes for us. Because, states still seem to want to obey international law, some of them. Israel, for example, is a perennial breacher of international law with its UN Security Council resolutions or ICJ resolutions. But we still have enough states in the world that want to work within the international legal norms and the systems, and we need to transform it and protect it. But it will be, as Oscar pointed out, to the detriment of all of us if there's double standards where country X will be held accountable for breaches of the Charter and country Y would be excused for breaches of the Charter. We can see, for example, the NATO Secretary General saying that the attacks by both Israel and the US were not illegal. I mean, I could not find any, part of the international legal system that will justify what has happened. Those kind of statements weaken the international system and could actually lead to its demise, and that will be to the detriment of all of us.
Yeah. What about BRICS? Is this something that is being brought up on the BRICS agenda, considering that Iran is also a member?
It is being discussed at BRICS, and it's being discussed in the context, as I've just laid out now, that there's the particular cases that we must deal with. It's Iran, it's what's happening in Gaza, it's what's happening in Sudan. But what we really want to do is shore up the accountability mechanisms to ensure that, on the one hand, those who breach international law are held accountable, but we also have the guardrails in place for civilians to be protected. And we can see the many humanitarian crises in the world, particularly in Gaza, at the sharper edge in Sudan. And we really need to ensure that we sharpen the systems to ensure that everybody is accountable.
DG, matter not related to geopolitics, but something on the continent. Zambia and the burial of a former president, Edgar Lungu. Has DIRCO been approached as yet by the Zambian government at all?
So we are not cited as a respondent, but we are in the papers as an interested party. So an interested party because the South Africa is the location that the family wants the burial to take place in. We have had engagements at the highest level with the Zambian authorities and pointed out that in our legal system, the family gets, they make the final decision. And this is now a case between the state of Zambia and the family. And it's unfortunate. We had hoped that they would come to some kind of resolution between the family and the state about the burial of the former president.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time, Zane Dangor.